The silent watcher. The station stood as a relic of time long past. Overgrown vines crawled over the crumbling walls, and the rusted metal of the old train tracks echoed the sounds of a forgotten era. The station hadn't seen a crowd in years, and the trains that occasionally rolled through seemed to pass by in a hurry, as if they had somewhere more important to be. The air was thick with the scent of dampness and old, decaying wood, the kind of smell that comes from a place forgotten by the world. On one particularly stormy night, the rain lashed against the cracked windows of the station like an unseen hand, trying to erase the building from existence. The wind howled through the broken walls, winding its way through the old, weather-beaten corridors. The streetlights outside flickered weakly, casting ghostly shadows over the rain-slicked pavement. It was a night that felt like it belonged to a different time, an in-between moment when the world seemed to pause, suspended in the grip of a deep, unsettling quiet. There was no one here except for him. The dog sat, unmoving, his coat matted and soaked through. His bones, visible beneath the thin layers of fur, trembled slightly in the cold, but he didn't shift. His eyes, deep and dark, reflected the years of suffering he had endured. His name had been Paulo once. He had been called that by someone long ago, though it had been so long since anyone had spoken that name that it might as well have been a ghost. The dog's gaze never strayed from the horizon, where the dim lights of the station's platform faded into the distance, swallowed by the storm. For 5 years, Paulo had been here, alone, waiting. The days blurred together, one indistinguishable from the next. He didn't move unless he had to. During the day, he wandered the station, scavenging for food, curling up under the rotting benches when the cold became unbearable. But every night, without fail, he returned to the same spot by the tracks. His eyes locked onto the distance, unblinking. He waited. For whom? For what? The townspeople had long since stopped asking, and those who didn't ignore him outright whispered that he was a ghost, a soul condemned to haunt the station, trapped in a cycle of eternal waiting. Walter, the station's elderly ticket clerk, was one of the few who had paid any attention to the dog. He had first noticed Paulo 5 years ago, on a cold autumn morning when the dog had appeared out of nowhere and sat by the station's entrance. At first, Walter had assumed the dog was just another stray, lost and hungry. But Paulo hadn't left. Day after day, he remained in the same spot, staring at the tracks, unyielding. And then Walter had noticed something strange. Every time a train arrived, Paulo would stand up, his body trembling with what seemed like anticipation. His eyes would widen, as though searching for something. Someone. But once the train doors closed and the train pulled away, Paulo would lower himself back to the ground, his eyes dimming, as if hope had been dashed once again. Walter had tried to understand. He had asked the townspeople if they knew anything about the dog, but no one seemed to know anything, or at least, no one wanted to talk about it. People had grown used to the dog's presence, accepting him as part of the station's strange and lonely atmosphere. Some thought he was just another lost animal, a casualty of the harshness of life. But Walter had grown attached to him, quietly caring for the dog whenever he could. He'd leave out scraps of bread, a bowl of water, and sometimes even speak to him softly, though he knew the dog could never understand. Still, there was something in Paulo's eyes, a deep, sorrowful understanding, that seemed to make Walter believe he was more than just a stray. Paulo's existence was a silent testament to something Walter could not yet understand. On nights when the rain poured down and the station was empty, Walter would step outside to see Paulo sitting by the tracks, his body frail from hunger and age, his eyes locked on the horizon, as if he were waiting for something. Walter had seen it countless times, the waiting, the hope, the inevitable heartbreak. And yet, despite the passing of seasons, despite the storms and the cold, Paulo never moved from his post. "Who are you waiting for, boy?" Walter would often ask quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking to the dog was the only way to understand the weight of his silence. But Paulo never answered, of course. He only waited. It was late one night when Walter stepped outside once more, as the storm raged against the station, and Paulo sat in his usual spot, staring down the tracks. The storm had picked up, with the wind howling through the broken walls, and the streetlights flickering weakly in the distance. Walter, his heart heavy with the weight of the dog's quiet sorrow, approached him with a small bowl of food. He bent down to place it in front of Paulo, the dog's ears twitching slightly at the sound, but his eyes remained fixed on the tracks. He did not move, did not eat. He just waited. The train's low hum filled the air, a sound that had become a constant in Walter's life. Paulo's body tensed as he heard it approach, and with a feeble yet determined strength, he lifted himself from the ground. His tail wagged slowly, a flicker of hope in his tired eyes. The train screeched to a stop, its doors sliding open. But as always, Paulo's eyes searched the faces of the passengers. They stepped off one by one, each passing by without a glance, without any recognition of the dog sitting there, waiting. The last passenger exited, and the whistle blew. The doors closed, and the train began to pull away, its wheels grinding against the tracks. Paulo's tail stilled, his body sank back to the ground, and the hope in his eyes vanished, swallowed by the darkness. Walter sighed deeply, running a hand through his thinning gray hair. He had seen this happen too many times. Every time, it ended the same way. Paulo waited, but no one ever came. "Maybe you're not waiting for someone who's still here," Walter murmured softly, his voice filled with a deep, aching sadness. "Maybe you're waiting for someone who's never coming back." The night grew colder, and Walter stood for a long time, staring down at the dog. The storm raged on, but in that moment, Walter felt a strange sense of connection with the silent creature who had been trapped in time for so long, never moving, never leaving. As he returned to his booth, the questions lingered in his mind. Who was Paulo waiting for? And why had no one come looking for him? The search for answers. The morning fog settled heavily over the town, like a blanket that refused to lift. It blurred the outlines of buildings and cast an eerie stillness over the streets. The rain from the night before had soaked the pavement, and the smell of wet earth and rusted metal lingered in the air. Inside the station, the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the wall, its hands moving relentlessly forward, while time seemed to stand still for the dog who never moved. Walter had arrived early, as was his habit. His bones ached from the cold, and his stiff joints creaked in protest as he moved slowly through the station, his breath visible in the air. But it wasn't the chill of the morning that made his chest tighten. It was the sight of Paulo, still in his usual spot, unmoving, eyes locked on the tracks. The dog's thin body was curled tightly against the cold, his fur once thick and golden, now dull and matted from the years of neglect. Walter had seen this scene countless times, but it never lost its impact. Paulo's presence, his unwavering vigilance, stirred something deep within Walter, a feeling of helplessness, a sense of injustice. For 5 long years, the dog had waited for something or someone who had never returned. Each day, each passing year, seemed to stretch the thread of Paulo's hope thinner and thinner. But no matter what, the dog refused to move, to leave. There had to be a reason, a purpose behind this endless waiting. Walter paused in front of the ticket counter, his eyes lingering on Paulo. He couldn't shake the thought that there was something more to this dog's story, something that was hidden beneath layers of time and silence. Someone had to know why the dog was here, why he had chosen this spot, why he had been waiting so faithfully, so hopelessly, for so many years. And Walter, for the first time in years, felt a fire of determination. He couldn't just stand by and watch anymore. He needed to find out what had happened to Paulo, to uncover the truth behind the dog's unyielding vigil. It wasn't the first time Walter had tried to investigate the dog's past. Over the years, he had asked around town, hoping someone might remember something about Paulo's history. But the townspeople had grown accustomed to the dog's presence, as if he had always been there, as if he were part of the landscape. Some whispered that he was a ghost, a spirit trapped in a world of endless waiting. Others ignored him completely, too afraid or too indifferent to ask questions. But Walter wasn't ready to accept that answer. He couldn't let this mystery slip away. He decided to start by looking through the station's records. Perhaps there was something, some trace of Paulo's past, that had been left behind in the dusty files, hidden away in the cluttered room that no one had visited in years. With a heavy sigh, Walter made his way to the back of the station, to the records room. It was a small, dimly lit space, filled with boxes of old paperwork, faded maintenance logs, and forgotten employee rosters. The air smelled musty, and the light from the single bulb overhead flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the room. It was a place that time had nearly swallowed whole. Walter began to sift through the papers, his fingers tracing over the yellowed pages, looking for anything that might offer a clue about the dog. Most of the records were dull. Maintenance reports, forgotten schedules, and incident logs about minor delays. But Walter refused to give up. He flipped through pages with a quiet urgency, the weight of his mission pressing on him. And then, hidden beneath a pile of old employee rosters, he found something. It was a faded report, marked with a date from 5 years ago. The ink was smudged, and the words were nearly illegible, but the details caught Walter's eye. A train accident. The report was short, almost cold in its precision. There was no mention of names, no family members listed, only a single sentence that caused Walter's heart to stop. A man believed to be traveling with a dog was struck by the train. No animal was found at the scene. Walter's hands trembled slightly as he read the words again. Could it be? Could this be the answer to the question that had haunted him for so long? Was Paulo's story tied to this tragic accident? If so, why had the dog been waiting for so long? Why had he never left? He sat down slowly, the paper still in his hands, his mind racing. The station had always been quiet, the passing trains distant memories for most of the town's inhabitants. But now, it felt as though something much larger was unfolding, something that would change everything Walter had come to believe about Paulo and his relentless waiting. He looked at the dog from the records room window. Paulo had not moved since Walter had arrived. His eyes, though clouded with age and weariness, were still fixed on the tracks, as though he were waiting for something that could never arrive. Walter's heart ached for the dog. The thought of the man who had been with him that night, someone, perhaps, who had once cared for him, who had loved him, struck Walter deeply. "Who are you waiting for, boy?" Walter whispered under his breath, the question feeling heavier than ever. He had spent so many years wondering, but now the answer seemed so close. The more Walter thought about it, the more he began to suspect that Paulo's grief wasn't just a result of the accident. It was the deep, unspoken bond between the dog and the man who had once been by his side. The dog had waited for 5 years, never moving, never leaving, because he was waiting for someone who would never return. Paulo wasn't just waiting for any passenger. He was waiting for the man who had been his companion, his family. The tragedy had left Paulo in a state of limbo, unable to let go, unable to move forward. Walter stood up slowly, his mind racing with the implications. He had to know more. He couldn't let this story fade into nothing, couldn't let the memory of this dog and his lost companion be forgotten. He had to find out who the man was, who had been traveling with Paulo that fateful night. Walter gathered the report in his hands, the pieces of the puzzle finally starting to come together. As he made his way back to the station floor, he glanced out at Paulo once more. The dog was still there, still waiting. But now, Walter understood. Paulo wasn't just waiting for a return to the past. He was waiting for the closure that had been denied him. A final goodbye, an end to the silent grief. "Don't worry, boy," Walter muttered softly. "I'm going to find out who you were waiting for. I promise." The lost connection. The days passed slowly for Walter as he dug deeper into the mystery that had taken root in his heart. With each visit to the station's records room, he uncovered more fragments of the past, small disjointed pieces that seemed to speak to the larger, untold story. The train accident had been an awful tragedy, and while the report had offered a few cold, factual details, it had not provided the answers Walter needed. Who was the man who had been traveling with Paula that night? Walter couldn't shake the image of the dog, sitting motionless by the tracks, his eyes dark with sorrow and unspoken grief. What had happened to that man? Why had Paula been left to wait, year after year, without ever moving from his spot? It was a puzzle, a riddle that haunted Walter's thoughts in the quiet moments between his work at the station. Every time he passed Paula, every time he left food for the dog or spoke a few words of comfort, it felt like something was slipping further out of his grasp. One afternoon, as Walter was preparing for his usual shift, he decided to go beyond the station's records room. There had to be more, something the papers hadn't told him. He needed to speak to someone who might know more about that fateful night, someone who could shed light on the accident, on the man who had been with Paula. He felt a growing sense of urgency. The questions in his mind were no longer just theoretical. They were becoming part of his own story, a connection he couldn't ignore. He decided to visit the local town archives, a place he hadn't been in years. The small, musty building was tucked away behind the town hall, almost hidden from sight by the overgrown ivy that had long since crept across its front. The smell of old paper and dust filled the air as Walter stepped inside, squinting at the dim light that filtered through the aging windows. There was something oddly comforting about the place. It felt like stepping into another time, an era when the town's past was alive in the pages of forgotten records and photographs. He approached the counter, where a young woman sat typing on a computer. She looked up at him with a friendly smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm looking for any information about a train accident that happened 5 years ago," Walter said, his voice calm but filled with purpose. It was on a rainy night, and there was a man involved. He was believed to be traveling with a dog. The woman's smile faded slightly, and she nodded. "I know the accident you're referring to. It was a tragic one. I can look it up for you, but it's a bit of a sensitive subject around here. Not many people like to talk about it." Walter's heart sank. He had suspected as much. Small towns had a way of keeping their darkest secrets hidden, but he wasn't going to turn back now. "Please," he said gently. "I need to know more. There's a dog, you see. He's been waiting here at the station for years. I think he's waiting for the man who was involved in that accident." The woman hesitated, but something in Walter's tone must have convinced her, because she nodded and stood up. "I'll see what I can find." As she disappeared into the back room, Walter's thoughts drifted back to the dog. Paulo had been waiting for 5 years, yet it seemed as though the world had forgotten about him, forgotten the promise that had been left unfulfilled. What could have happened to make Paulo stay? What had bonded him to this man, so much that he could never leave the tracks? The woman returned with a stack of faded papers in her hands. "This is all we have in the archive," she said, handing them to Walter. "But it's not much." The man's name was Victor Caldwell. He was a traveler passing through when the accident occurred. Walter scanned the papers quickly, his eyes locking onto the name. Victor Caldwell. It was an ordinary name, and yet something about it felt significant. The details were sparse, just a few notes about the accident, the fact that the man had been found on the tracks, and that no animal had been found nearby at the time. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Walter's heart race. He turned the pages, trying to make sense of the few lines that were written. There were no family contacts listed, no next of kin. The information was minimal, almost as though the town had been trying to bury the event along with the man who had passed away. The last entry, written in bold, stark letters, made Walter's heart stop. Animal presumed to be traveling with Victor Caldwell. No animal found at scene. Case closed. Walter's mind reeled. No animal had been found. But Paulo had been there, waiting all these years. Could it be that the dog had witnessed the accident? Could he have been with Victor when the tragedy occurred? Walter looked up at the woman, his voice a whisper. "Is there anything else? Any photos? Any relatives who might still live here?" The woman shook her head. Victor had no family here. He was just passing through. His name didn't even make it to the local papers because it was such a small incident. The town moved on. We all moved on. Walter felt a pang of sadness in his chest, the weight of those words pressing down on him. We all moved on. But Paulo hadn't moved on. Paulo had waited, faithfully, relentlessly, for 5 long years. Walter felt the answer was just on the edge of his consciousness, like a memory he couldn't quite recall. But now, with the name Victor Caldwell echoing in his mind, he was closer than ever to understanding. "Thank you," Walter said, his voice thick with emotion. He tucked the papers into his coat and made his way back to the station, his mind racing with new questions. Victor Caldwell was no longer a nameless, faceless victim of an accident. He had been a person, a traveler. And now, with the pieces starting to come together, Walter wondered what kind of connection there had been between this man and Paulo. What had made the dog wait for so long? What had been lost in that moment of tragedy? When Walter returned to the station, the dog was still there. He hadn't moved. His eyes were still locked on the tracks, as though the train might suddenly come, bringing with it the one he had been waiting for. Walter walked over to him, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had just learned. "Victor," he whispered, as if the name could bridge the gap between the living and the lost. "I think I finally understand." Walter stood there for a long time, watching Paulo. He wasn't just a dog, waiting for someone. He was a living memory, a living connection to a man who had passed through this town, a man whose fate had been sealed by an accident. And now, Paulo waited, silent, steadfast, unwilling to move until this promise was fulfilled. The final farewell. The air was thick with the fog of early morning, and the station felt even emptier than usual. Walter had spent the night with his thoughts, the truth about Victor Caldwell and the dog, Paulo, still reverberating in his mind. There was an ache in his chest, a longing for closure that seemed impossible to reach. The story was coming to an end, but Walter still couldn't shake the feeling that something more was yet to be revealed, something that would finally put the pieces together. The days passed, and the truth Walter had uncovered began to weigh on him. Paulo had been waiting for Victor, the man who had once walked beside him, the man who had given him love and companionship. That night, the train had come. Victor had stepped off, and in a tragic twist, he had been struck by the train. Paulo, the loyal dog, had witnessed it all. It had been the end of their shared journey, but the dog's bond to the man had been so deep, so unshakable, that Paulo had refused to move. He waited for 5 years, not out of hope, but out of a promise, a deep, silent understanding that something had been left unfinished. Walter couldn't help but think that perhaps Paulo had known all along, that perhaps the dog had been waiting not for the man's return, but for something else, an acknowledgement, a final goodbye, a resolution. In the years that followed, the townspeople had come and gone, but Paulo had remained, a constant figure, rooted in grief and memory. Walter had spent the last few weeks asking questions, speaking to anyone who might know something about Victor and his time in town. But the town had moved on. The accident had faded from their collective memory. No one knew about the bond between Victor and Paulo. It seemed that the dog's suffering had been his alone to bear. And yet, despite everything, Walter could feel that Paulo's vigil had a purpose. He had not waited in vain. The mystery was not just about a lost man or an abandoned dog. It was about love, loss, and the human connection that transcends time. Paulo's unwavering dedication to the man he had loved had kept him anchored to the station, even when the world had moved on. One evening, as Walter stood at the station, gazing out at the tracks, he heard the soft, familiar sound of the approaching train. His heart skipped a beat, and he turned to see Paulo sitting at the same spot he had occupied for 5 long years. But this time, there was something different. The dog's eyes were not filled with sorrow, nor were they locked onto the horizon in anticipation. Instead, Paulo's gaze was soft, almost peaceful. Walter approached slowly, his steps faltering slightly as the train screeched to a stop. The doors slid open, and passengers hurried past, indifferent to the dog that had waited so long. But as Walter bent down beside Paulo, he noticed something that caught his breath. A faint shape, shimmering in the distance, stood near the edge of the platform. Walter squinted, unsure if his eyes were playing tricks on him. But the shape grew clearer with each passing moment. It was a man, a figure, his outline almost translucent, as if he had stepped out of the past itself. Walter's heart raced. He recognized him immediately. It was Victor Caldwell. The man appeared to be walking toward Paulo, his movements slow but purposeful. There was no hesitation in his steps, no fear. It was as if he had never left, as if the years had not passed. Walter watched in awe as the man reached the dog, who stood up, his body trembling with emotion. Victor knelt down in front of Paulo, his hand reaching out to stroke the dog's head. The connection between them was undeniable, the bond between man and dog stronger than any words could describe. Walter stood back, his chest tight with emotion as he witnessed the reunion. It was as if time had folded in on itself, and the moments that had been lost were being stitched back together. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. No wind, no rain, no passing trains. The world held its breath as Victor and Paulo shared a final, quiet moment together. And then, as quickly as he had appeared, Victor began to fade. His form became translucent, barely a whisper in the air. Paulo, who had never stopped waiting, stood still, his tail still and his eyes soft. He had found his closure, his answer. He had waited, and now it was time to let go. Walter watched as the figure of Victor Caldwell disappeared completely, leaving only the sound of the wind and the passing train behind. Paulo remained standing, his gaze lingering on the tracks, but there was a new understanding in his eyes, an understanding that the waiting was finally over. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the station, Walter approached the dog. Paulo turned to him, his eyes still reflecting the pain of years past. But now, there was something else. A quiet peace, a sense of release. Walter knelt beside him and placed a hand on the dog's matted fur, feeling the weight of the years they had both endured. "You did it, boy," Walter whispered. "You waited, and you found what you needed." Paulo let out a soft, contented sigh, as if acknowledging that the journey was finally complete. He was no longer the silent watcher at the station. He had found his peace, and with it, his freedom. The station, once filled with quiet sorrow, now felt different. It was as though the weight of the years had been lifted. The trains that passed through no longer carried the same haunting silence. They seemed to sing a different tune, one of hope, of new beginnings, and of memories that would never fade. And as the stars began to twinkle overhead, Walter knew that the mystery had been solved. Paulo had not been waiting for someone who would never come back. He had been waiting for the moment when he could let go, when he could say goodbye and move on. Walter watched as the dog slowly padded away from the tracks, his body tired but his spirit free. It was the end of a long journey, a journey that had started with sorrow, but had ended with peace. As Walter turned to leave, he looked back one last time. The station was quiet once again, but this time, it felt like the beginning of something new. Paulo had finally found his rest, and so too had the story of the lost traveler and his faithful dog. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.